In September 1940, Hitler commanded his air force, the Luftwaffe, to wreak death and destruction on Britain. A series of terrifying night raids left thousands of civilians dead and cities across the nation in ruins. But while the rest of the UK prepared for German attacks, the citizens of Belfast, governed by a complacent administration at Stormont, believed they were beyond the Nazis' reach.
Belfast was the least well-protected major porter city in the United Kingdom.
We thought we were away from it all because we thought the Germans couldn't fly their planes as far.
But in spring 1941, the Luftwaffe were preparing for a major aerial attack. Their target? Belfast. And the impact on the unprepared citizens living there was catastrophic. Over the course of 3 hellish raids, Belfast faced an onslaught which would strike at the very heart of the city, changing it and the lives of those who lived in Belfast forever. Belfast in the 1930s was a small city with a population of just under 500,000. Ruled by its own government at Stormont, it was a port city, a lifeline between Britain and the US. Its docks were of great strategic importance to both nations. The city was also a major industrial centre. A network of factories and engineering works dominated the port. Harland and Wolff shipbuilders, Short and Harland aircraft factory, Rank flour mill, Mackey's foundry, York Street mill, and McHugh Dick's timber yards. And the workers lived just outside the factory doors, in narrow streets of poorly constructed houses. In September 1939, this peaceful existence was threatened by the outbreak of war.
I am speaking to you from the Cabinet Room at 10 Downing Street. It's been quite possible to have arranged a peaceful and honourable settlement between Germany and Poland.
In London, preparations against enemy attack were immediate and vigorous. Barrage balloons protected the city, air raid shelters were erected, and thousands of men conscripted. But in 1939 Belfast, there were few visible signs on the city streets that war with Germany had been declared. The nightly blackout was compulsory but difficult to enforce in Belfast, as volunteer air raid warden Jimmy Wilton found out on his rounds.
People were careless about their lights, and if their light was on, you could see it. And our duty was to wrap up there and ask them to come out onto the street and say, do you see that? Well, now, if you can see it here, anybody in an aircraft flying overhead, it stands out like a beacon.
Air raid sirens regularly rang out across the city as a warning that enemy aircraft could be near. But 22 false alarms before Belfast experienced an attack meant that the sound carried little fear and life continued as normal. Air raid shelters were one way of protecting the general public, but Westminster had ordered Stormont to prioritise building airfields. So a year into the war, there were only 200 public shelters in Belfast to hold a population of 500,000. Belfast was also poorly defended in comparison to the rest of the UK. While Liverpool secured over 100 heavy anti-aircraft guns to shield it, Belfast was granted 16, with no searchlights to illuminate enemy aircraft. Then, in June 1940, the threat suddenly intensified. The German army marched into France and took control of air bases along the coast. Hitler sent squadrons of Luftwaffe to await his command for an attack on the UK, now only a short flight away. As London was still reeling from its first bombardment, the Luftwaffe were already planning more attacks, this time on industrial cities outside the capital. As secret files prepared by the Luftwaffe reveal, Belfast was one of them. By autumn 1940, unaware of just how vulnerable Northern Ireland had become, new Prime Minister J.M. Andrews made his support for the war against Germany clear and unequivocal. Harland and Wolff were building minesweepers, aircraft carriers and destroyers. Short and Harland were turning out Stirling bombers and Sunderland flying boats. But despite the activity in their factories and daily news on bombing elsewhere in the UK, the war still seemed far away for the people of Belfast. However, the Germans gave a stark indication that Belfast was within reach in January 1941, when the Luftwaffe dropped bombs on neutral Dublin.
Houses at Rathdown Park, Dublin, fall victims to Hitler's bombs. 7 people were trapped when the Nazi raiders deliberately unloaded their bombs on these houses in error.
The Irish government interpreted this attack as a warning to stay neutral. Ministers in Stormont, however, saw the bombing of Dublin as a reason to finally go on red alert. These 8 bombers were on an exploratory raid to test the city's defences. Their target was the dock area. The following day, 10-year-old Kathleen Regan witnessed the devastating aftermath of the raid in streets close by. Luftwaffe pilots recorded that the city's defences were weak and scanty. The ease with which they'd carried out this first raid encouraged German command to begin planning another mission. On Easter Monday 1941, the people of Belfast were celebrating the holiday on day trips to the country and seaside. 23-year-old Rita Wade spent the day with her mother. The plane spotted by Rita's mother was the prelude to an armada of bombers who were preparing for takeoff. Their destination once again, Belfast. Many families were too scared to stay in their own homes. Belfast is a city surrounded by hills. A stream of people headed for the slopes of Divis, Black Mountain and Cave Hill, hoping to escape the bombs. There followed wave after wave of German planes, heavily laden with deadly explosives, which floated down on parachutes across the city. Belfast's industries were the Luftwaffe's primary target, but it was the surrounding residential areas which suffered most. North Belfast came under severe attack, as Ethna O'Connor discovered when she took refuge with her mother and sister in an air raid shelter on Atlantic Avenue. There was mayhem throughout Belfast as the bombs continued to fall. The 17 anti-aircraft guns stationed in open ground across the city were no match for the Luftwaffe bombers. By 1:45 a.m., the Luftwaffe had complete command of the skies over Belfast. Their deadly cargo turned parts of the city into an inferno, which overwhelmed the local fire services. Teresa, aged 8, escaped serious injury, but some of her family were not so fortunate. As dawn broke on the morning of Easter Tuesday, the people of Belfast were in a profound state of shock. The raid had left carnage in its wake. Entire streets had been wiped out, and the number of dead would rise steadily to nearly 1,000. 10-year-old Sammy Clark lived with his family close to the shipyard. After his mother died in 1940, Sammy was one of the few Belfast children evacuated to the countryside. His father, a dock worker, stayed behind in the city. On a clear moonlit night in May 1941, squadrons of Luftwaffe bombers left their bases in northern France. From the safety of the countryside, Sammy watched as they descended on Belfast. On their third raid, the Luftwaffe's main targets were the docks. But so relentless was the attack that the city was soon a sea of flames. Unlike the previous raids, Belfast city centre now experienced the full brunt of a Luftwaffe attack. High explosives and incendiaries dropped on Belfast's oldest and most historic streets. Northern Ireland's industries continued to play a major part in the war effort. So much so that a victorious Churchill wrote to Stormont in 1945 declaring, "But for the loyalty of Northern Ireland, we should have been confronted with slavery and death, and the light which now shines so strongly throughout the world would have been quenched." But the price paid by the people of Belfast and Northern Ireland was a heavy one. And 70 years on, the impact still lingers within those who experienced the Belfast Blitz.